What is good, everyone? Welcome to the channel. My name is Paul. I make videos about Japanese society, life, and culture from the viewpoint of a long-term foreign resident. I've been in Japan for 20 years, and today I'm going to be talking about a phenomena that afflicts anyone who has any kind of romantic attachment or feelings for the country of Japan and Japanese culture. That could be whether you live here or not, but everyone who has that kind of romantic feeling for Japan is probably afflicted by this, and it's something that I call borrowed nostalgia. Borrowed nostalgia is essentially a longing for, a desire to have been in a era of Japan that you missed, or from the past that you didn't get to witness personally. I think everyone who loves Japan wishes they could have been here during blah 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 era, whatever that might be. And so today I'm going to share the eras which I have the strongest nostalgia, borrowed nostalgia for. And I'd like to invite you to comment in the comment section below which era of Japan you have the most borrowed nostalgia for. You would have most liked to have witnessed Japan during whatever period that is. Please comment your choice. I'm going to share my absolute favorite choice at the end of the video, so also I invite you to guess which era does Paul have the most borrowed nostalgia for. You might be surprised. Now, the reason for this topic is I had a comment on a recent video where someone basically mentioned that they wish they could have come to Japan at the time that I did, so that they could have seen Japan before the current big tourist boom. And I thought, oh, okay, I guess I am also now one of those people who lived in Japan in a bygone era that people can feel nostalgic for. So that was surprising to me, but well, I guess it makes sense. So with that comment, I thought about this topic and began to realize that a lot of my romantic notions of Japan really are borrowed nostalgia for eras that I didn't get to experience personally. I would say the era we're in now is one where Japan is very mainstream suddenly. Like, it's become a popular tourist destination spot in a way that it never was before. More and more foreign tourists showing up, and I mean, I just visited Shinjuku and Shibuya earlier this week, and I hadn't been there since, well, I went there briefly during the pandemic when no tourists were here, so that's a different story. But basically, I was just shocked at what a madhouse it is. It honestly reminded me of walking the streets of New York, because when you walk down the street in New York City, you hear like 10 languages within a block. And going across Shibuya Scramble was the same thing. Like, just 10 languages went past me as I was walking through that intersection. So, yeah, Japan is the era of, or I should say Japan is in the era of increasing tourism, and it's very apparent when you go to certain parts of Japan. Now, returning to Yokohama Station later that day, I was struck by how it felt to me like Shinjuku did back in 2002 when I first arrived. So that was an interesting juxtaposition. But I digress. The era I arrived in, yes, it was pre-tourist boom, but it was also pre-social media. It was pre-smartphone. 2002, there was barely any information on the internet in English about Japan. This was the era when you still had to go to a bookshop and buy a physical copy of a travel book like Lonely Planet or Frommer's or something like that. And you had to read from the book the travel writer's recommendations for places to eat, places to stay, places to see, and things to experience. So it was more of an adventure back then, let's put it that way. There was far, far less English available, even official English that you would find in like train stations and the like. Back then there would be one map in the station that had English on it, and you'd have to find that one map. Like, all the other maps would just be in Japanese, and you had to find the one that was in English for you. Buses, things like that, no way. Like, the highway buses I used to ride back then had only announcements in Japanese. So navigating the country was, well, like I said, it was more of an adventure, and you had to learn the Japanese for travel pretty quickly because it was harder to get around. But what eras do I feel borrowed nostalgia for? The first one is just going back 10-15 years from when I first arrived to the early 90s, mid 80s. We're talking the Japan bubble era, when everyone was feeling wealthy, money was being thrown around, the country was rich. It was basically one big party based on Japan having become such an economic powerhouse. It would have been really interesting and fun to experience Japan during that time because, well, as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed foreigner, what I understand is it was pretty easy to get a high-paying job teaching English because everyone had money to spend, and English was a skill that people wanted to acquire. And it seems like I could have had a lot of fun here during those days. That was also the era if I wanted to get into university teaching. I know a number of guys who basically came during that era and got tenured professor positions with only a bachelor's degree. That's unheard of now. I mean, that's not happening. So I'm not knocking those guys. Good on them for getting those jobs back then, and the ones I know are good teachers. But I wouldn't say that is the era that I feel the most borrowed nostalgia for. Let's go back another 10-15 years to basically the mid-70s to the 60s, and that was Japan. Economic miracle is in the making. They're not totally rich yet, and this is an era that Alex Kerr, the author, has written a lot about because he partially grew up in Japan and then came back as a university student, and he speaks fluent Japanese, and he wrote about how he just kind of fell into these arrangements and relationships. He met this super famous kabuki actor. He ended up being part of the Kyoto antique scene because this is the era when Kyoto was rapidly modernizing. I was actually disappointed the first time I visited Kyoto because I was still expecting kind of the old wooden house city that I had in my imagination, and by 2002 that was long gone. It was, it's all modern. It doesn't look like the city that's in your mind. Pretty much, if you aren't visiting the famous shrines and temples or preserved areas, it looks pretty much like any other city. But this is the era when Kyoto was basically being torn down and the old kuras, or storehouses, were being opened up, and all of the antiques were pouring out of those storehouses, and Japanese weren't interested because this was Japan trying to become modern and Japan trying to become a nation like the West, basically embracing more and more Western ideas and building styles and housing, etc. And so no one wanted old Japanese things. So you would go to these auctions in Kyoto, and Alex Kerr describes this in his book, Lost Japan, and these amazing antiquities, beautiful paintings, prints, folding screens that you'd have to be Jeff Bezos to be able to buy today, were going for incredibly cheap prices because Japanese didn't want them. So I love antiques, especially paintings and prints, and I would love to have a genuine antique folding screen, but as I mentioned, I'm not Jeff Bezos. Basically, yeah, that would have been a great time to have been in Japan to experience some of those things. But it's not my most borrowed nostalgic period. We can go back another 10 years to the 50s, and this is the post-war period. Japan is getting back on its feet. It probably would have been a rougher time to be in Japan, although as a foreigner you probably would have still had some of the perks of being called upon for your expertise in language or whatnot. But the reason I would have liked to have been in Japan during that era is largely because of the writings of people like Donald Ritchie, who wrote about the post-war period, basically travelogues, portraits of people that he met. Especially the book I would recommend is The Inland Sea, where he's traveling around the Seto Inland Sea, which is the islands in between the main island Honshu and one of the main islands, Shikoku. And just the experiences of, basically you get the feeling of, from his writing, that he's writing about all these things that he knows are disappearing and he knows are going to be gone soon enough. And as someone living in this era, you can recognize the Japan he's describing, but it's absolutely gone. Like, that Japan doesn't exist anymore. And you can't help but feel the borrowed nostalgia reading his writing and think, I would have loved to have witnessed Japan and what it was like during those times. But it is not my most borrowed nostalgia period. I don't think we need to talk about the wartime period and the rise of Imperial Japan, and I think the only people that are nostalgic for that time are, right-wing activists who want to see Japan be a military power again. I don't think most people pine for that time period in Japan, and I certainly don't. But we can go back to the Taisho era and late Meiji era, which seems like it would have been a very interesting time to see Japan, because you would have seen the first genuine mix of Western influence, but old Japanese things were still treasured and revered. You can see things like, the way people dressed, which was a mix of Western and Japanese. And it would have been an interesting time because there was like a growing intelligentsia. There was like the literary scene was amazing. The art and music scene was pretty amazing. The things that Japan embraced from the outside and were thriving, things like coffee shop culture has very old roots in Japan. But even though that would have been a cool time to be in Japan, it's, again, not the era that I feel the most borrowed nostalgia. Now, some might think I'm all building up to talk about the Warring States period or the Shogun period and like have been in Japan during the time of samurai, but actually, as exciting as those times are and as interesting as those times are, I don't think I would have liked to have been in Japan at that time. Standing out as a foreigner would have been tough to have been in Japan during that period, because, well, you wouldn't have had any kind of freedom of movement. Like, you couldn't travel the country. You'd be either dodging authorities or working for them. So, it would be interesting to have witnessed life like that, or even further back, like the Heian period, and like witnessed the famous court life of Kyoto back then. But I don't have any nostalgia for those times. Instead, the period I have the most borrowed nostalgia for is the early Meiji or Bakumatsu period, which is the end of the shogunate. Basically, when the shogun eventually abdicated power. This is all about Japan's opening to the West after nearly 300 years of isolation. What an amazing time to have come to Japan as a foreigner. Basically, you were going to be witnessing all of old Japan before the transformation, and then begin to see the beginnings of those transformations, in front of your very eyes. You could have come here and traveled Japan and experienced it completely untouched by Western influence at that point. And some of these accounts, I highly recommend the book Deer Cry Pavilion by Pat Barr, because that book is basically journal entries of foreigners who were experiencing Japan during that time. And if you came at that time, you would be among the first foreigners to have laid your eyes on Kyoto. You would have been among the first foreigners to have seen the castle of the shogun. Basically, you could have been the first at almost anything. This is the time when Sir Rutherford Alcock, the British consulate, was the first foreigner to climb Mount Fuji. Can you imagine being the first foreigner to do that? It would have been a cool time to be here. And as someone who loves the aforementioned antiques, it would have been a great time to buy Japanese prints and paintings and even possibly meet the artists who made them. But yeah, that would have been an amazing time to have been in Japan. And I love reading the accounts of the foreigners who were here at that time. But how about you? Which period of Japan would you most have liked to have been here for? Let us know in the comments. And are you surprised by my choice, the Bakumatsu early Meiji era? Let us know in the comments. And remember, the best way to support this channel is to hit that like button, subscribe. Please share this video with anyone you think would be interested in watching it. And if you want to support the channel really directly, I do have a Patreon, and I do have a sponsorship with Sakura-ko, the Japanese artisan snack box subscription service. You'll find those links below, and you can support the channel that way. You can use my discount code, for example, on Sakura-ko, so look for that. And also, I did recently partner with a Japanese language school that it does their language teaching online, and it comes very highly recommended. And you can get 2 free lessons if you use my link and my code below. And if you sign up, you'll definitely be helping the channel that way as well. But again, like and subscribe. Those are the main 2 that really help me out. And I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video today. I hope to see you on the next one. Peace.